Okay, so we're going to start a new unit. It's about the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 to about 1991. So you can see what's in front of you right here are notes on the first part of that, 1945 to 1960. Then there's notes on the second part of it. And there's about 10 questions that go with each set of notes. And they're kind of just the essentials, or as it says on the sheet, you'll get what you need to know. Okay, and so I want to run through what you need to know, part one, real quick over the next few minutes. I would like you to do these two very simple worksheets and get them done this week. This is Wednesday, and I would like you to have them done by Friday. Okay, both of them. Okay, so here goes. And as always, there's a definition. I'd like you to write that down. And if you know anything, that's the thing you need to know. That it was this 46-year-long conflict. It was almost a war, a hot war, but never really broke out into a real war, and so therefore was called the Cold War. There were a bunch of hot skirmishes like the Vietnam War or the Korean War, but never an actual all-out war, World War III, between the USSR and the United States. All right, you should need to know that it started at the end of World War II. We had operated under the arrangement that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and even though Russia didn't like us and we didn't like them, we liked each other a lot more than we liked Nazi Germany, so we collaborated and cooperated and were allies. But now the war was almost over. And at these two conferences, it kind of set the parameters of what was going to happen. We wanted the Russians to help us against Japan at Yalta, and therefore were relatively lenient in letting Russia kind of get away with stuff that we knew was not quite right, and we tried to stop them from doing, but we're kind of had an arm tied behind our back because we wanted them to help us against Japan. And then the Potsdam Conference, which happened in July after the war in Europe was completely over, but the war against Japan was not, we had the same kind of thing going on until we found out in the middle of the conference that the atomic bomb had been perfected, and then we realized we had another option rather than having the Russians help us actually invade Japan, and the Cold War kind of bloomed right from there. And some of the concessions that we made, that President Roosevelt, who was only about 3 or 4 weeks left to live in his life when he was pictured here at this first conference, had to kind of bite his tongue a little bit because we needed the Russians. We needed the Russians. In fact, the Russians set up a bunch of satellites, so-called, other countries that revolved around them as a buffer zone against them in Germany. There are the countries right there. And we warned them, Roosevelt warned them, that this couldn't be accepted, but Roosevelt then died, and the new president, President Truman, came along, and things got worse. And it was at this next conference when it was the atomic bomb prototype was set off, and we realized we had a weapon that it became kind of a break between the countries, and you can read that. Obviously, it worsened after that. It was all about the division of Germany. No one, us or the Soviet Union or anybody else, wanted Germany to rise a third time and start a World War III, and so Germany was partitioned at the end of the war. And there was a lot of friendship at the beginning, but that quickly went away, and there was arguments over how Germany would be administered, and it was made worse because of these occupation zones that were set up by the four countries. The Russian zone was in the east, and the American, French, and British zones were in the west, but the capital of the country was in the east, and that complicated things. We'll see why and how. There you see a picture of it. That's East Germany on the left, and East and West Berlin on the right map, and you can see that all of Berlin is within Eastern Germany, the Russian zone. The Prime Minister, the ex-Prime Minister by this time of England, Winston Churchill quickly gave this a name. He called it the Iron Curtain, that the Soviet Union had dropped this curtain on what they were doing, and they were setting up a fortress for themselves, and they were keeping everything and everybody else out. And this was often called the beginning of the Cold War. And the conflicts happened over what was going on in Europe. And we came up with a strategy that was what we were going to do for the entire rest of the Cold War. I will spend a minute on that. It was developed by this gentleman who you've never heard of by the name of George Kennan. It's not important to know him, but we do need to know the strategy, which was known as containment. Containment. Sort of like if there's a grass fire, we can't put it out, but we can keep it from burning the house down by containing it, and that was the concept. A couple of different examples that you should at least be able to reference. One is the Truman Doctrine, named for President Truman, who said we would help anybody who was resisting attacks. He didn't mention the Russians by name, but that's what he meant when he said armed minorities or outside pressure. Well, Russia was the outside pressure. And he meant to do that everywhere. And the Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, came up with a plan that was named after him, in which he said we should help war-torn Europe in the years after the war because it will make them prosperous, it'll make them stand up on their own feet, and will make them less likely to come under Soviet control, and it's money well spent. And we would do that if they would cooperate with us and each other, and that's the beginning of the European Union that we have today. It's the beginning of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that you've heard of, that still exists today. They had to work with each other, and they had to work with us. That's all. The Russians could have joined, but they chose not to. And because they chose not to, it made this Iron Curtain even more of a barrier. Germany finally officially divided over conflicts between us and the Russians. They tried to keep us out of Berlin. They tried to keep us out of our headquarters in Berlin. They tried to drive us all the way out of Germany. It almost resulted in a war, but instead, Truman came up with the idea of bailing out Berlin with an airlift, and that worked. And then, another important point that you should know is in 1949, it wasn't about Germany or Central Europe anymore. It was about the world. Communism spread to China when we least expected it. The USSR developed their own atomic bomb when we, before that, were the only country that had one. And the Cold War became a hot war when the Korean War started. And the Korean War is its own separate topic, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But these things profoundly surprised Americans and made us think, OMG, what's going on? Those are the three leaders that Korea has had. You can see at the bottom left, not King, someone who typed this can't type, Kim Jong-un is the third, the grandson of the founder who was set up by the Russians back in 1949. And it's still a problem to this very day. One reason why the Cold War is still relevant is that North Korea is still relevant, and North Korea has atomic weapons, and they're aimed at the United States, and they may or may not have the missile power to hit the United States. And that's still an ongoing thing. All this led to a Red Scare, frightened many Americans. We'll talk about that separately someday. But it was such a panic in the country, such a panic that there were communists in our country, Reds as they were called, and that all kinds of people were accused and of being involved in giving secrets to the Russians and this and that, that it led to much, much panic. So much panic that the Cincinnati Reds had to change their name slightly to Red Legs so they wouldn't be confused as being communists, to give you an idea of how panicked people were. The whole scare was given the name of Joseph McCarthy. It was called McCarthyism because he was the main scaremonger, and it caused bitter divides within the United States, the idea that some people might be communists. There really probably weren't any, or at least very many. President Truman retired in 1953, and the new president elected was the former general, leader at D-Day, Dwight Eisenhower, became President Eisenhower now, and his idea was to use our military superiority to not start nuclear war, but to prevent nuclear war by threatening the use of our nuclear arsenal. It was called massive retaliation. And we never did actually do that, but one of the unforeseen results of that was an arms race, a nuclear arms race with the Russians to develop the biggest and the worst bomb and the most of them. And it led us to the very brink of war a couple different times. You can read that. We'll probably need to read that. There were numerous crises went on in secret types of development and uprisings and all kinds of stuff that all had the potential for nuclear war. Russia had a new leader, Khrushchev, and Khrushchev and Eisenhower got together to try to kind of defuse the situation because it had led to something that you should know known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. That is, we can kill them and they can kill us, and if somebody kills somebody, everybody's dead. And the idea was that it was so bad that nobody would kill anybody because nobody wanted to end up dead. But that was kind of precarious because what if somebody did something? And so there were talks. And the talks seemed to be making a little bit of progress in 1959, and they hoped again to meet again in 1960, when what happened before the 1960 meeting could occur is that a spy plane, this is in the days before GPS and satellites, an American spy plane was shot down taking pictures of Russia, and it made things worse, not better. And that's the way the situation was as of 1960. In early 1961, there was an attempt by the United States to overthrow the new government in Cuba, the island right off of Florida, because the new leader was a communist. And that led in the next year to the worst moment of the Cold War, which we'll talk about in the second half. All right, I want you to complete this worksheet ASAP, and there will be a second one following by tomorrow, and I would like both of those done by Friday if you possibly can, because we want to move on and finish with the new material that we'll cover this year as soon as possible. All right, have a great day. Stay safe. Talk to you later.